The first order came through him, not El Mencho. No one questioned it. The message moved down the chain, and everything followed as usual. Shipments adjusted, routes shifted, payments cleared. On the surface, nothing looked different. But inside the structure, the change was already understood. Control had moved. There was no announcement. No formal transition. In that system, authority is never declared, it is recognized. The men inside it don't wait for confirmation. They watch who gives orders, who resolves problems, and who others listen to without hesitation. Within days, more decisions began stopping at his level. Disputes were brought directly to him. Issues that once moved upward were handled where they stood. He didn't expand loudly. He moved only where necessary, taking control of outcomes instead of positions. That was enough. He had been close to the center long before this shift. He understood how decisions traveled, who controlled which parts of the operation, and where pressure points existed. More importantly, he knew which men were reliable and which ones were not. He didn't replace El Mencho all at once. He replaced him in function first. Inside the organization, people adjusted quickly. They didn't ask questions. They followed patterns. Once enough of them started waiting for his decisions instead of someone else's, the transition was complete. From that point forward, he was the one holding it together. Outside the organization, the change didn't stay hidden for long. Rival groups noticed through disruption. Small interference began appearing along controlled routes. Shipments slowed. Movements were interrupted in ways that weren't random. These were tests designed to measure response. They were watching for hesitation. There wasn't any. Orders came back immediately. Adjustments were made without delay. The disruptions stopped as quickly as they started. That told them what they needed to know. The structure was still functioning. But it also revealed something else. There was someone new making those decisions. His name started circulating soon after. At first within limited circles, then more widely. The consistency of the responses pointed to one person. The organization hadn't weakened, it had shifted. That made him visible. Visibility changed the situation. The more his role became clear, the more attention gathered around him. Rival groups began tracking patterns. Authorities started connecting information. Even within his own structure, people began reassessing their position in relation to him. Pressure didn't arrive suddenly. It built in layers. At first, it was observation. Then it became focus. Information moved quickly through the same channels that follow power changes. The message was simple. There was a new figure in control, and he was no longer operating in the background. Then the number appeared. $15 million. That number changed behavior immediately. It turned him from a leader into a target, not for one group, but for multiple interests at the same time. Government forces, rival organizations, and independent operators all began moving in the same direction, toward him. Each group had different reasons. Some wanted leverage, some wanted removal, others wanted the reward. But their actions overlapped, and that created pressure from multiple sides. From that point forward, conditions changed. Movement became restricted. Locations shifted more frequently. Communication narrowed to smaller controlled channels. Fewer people knew where he was or where he would be next. Inside the organization, adjustments were immediate. Layers were added between him and the ground-level operations. Direct contact became limited. Messages passed through fewer trusted individuals. These changes reduced exposure, but they also slowed the system. Control became less direct. Decisions took longer to reach execution. Information moved more carefully. Trust became limited to a smaller circle. The structure remained intact, but it was operating under different conditions. Despite that, operations continued. Routes stayed active, money moved. Orders were followed without resistance. From the outside, nothing appeared broken. The transition had worked. But the pressure didn't stop. it remained constant. Every movement carried risk. Every decision created exposure. The position he had taken brought everything with it: authority, attention, and pursuit at the same time. He didn't step back from it. He stayed in place and kept the structure running. That required control, but it also required adjustment. The longer he remained visible, the more information built around him. Patterns began to form. Movements became easier to anticipate. The space he could operate in started shrinking. Not suddenly, but steadily. Each security measure reduced risk in one area and increased it in another. More protection meant less speed. Less speed meant slower responses. Slower responses created new vulnerabilities. The balance became harder to maintain. Inside the organization, no one challenged his authority. Orders still came through him, and they were still followed. The structure recognized him as the leader. Outside, no one ignored him. That combination created a different kind of pressure. He had taken control without conflict. There had been no internal collapse, no visible struggle. The system had accepted him, and it continued to function under his direction. But the environment around him had changed. He was no longer operating in the background. He was no longer insulated by someone else's position. Everything that had once been directed at Mencho was now directed at him. The role didn't just transfer authority. It transferred exposure. He understood that. That was why he limited movement, reduced visibility, and narrowed communication. Every adjustment was designed to reduce the chances of being located, tracked, or approached. But those adjustments came with limits. The more he reduced exposure, the more he restricted his own ability to control operations directly. The system had to function with less access to him. That created distance, and distance always carries risk. Still, the structure held. From the outside, it appeared stable. From the inside, it was operating under constant pressure. He had secured the position. That part was finished. What remained was maintaining it under conditions that were tightening around him with each passing day. Because in that world, taking power is immediate. Holding it depends on how long you can operate while everything moves against you. And by the time the pressure becomes visible, it has already been building for too long. The first mistake wasn't visible. It didn't come from a bad decision or a failed operation. It came from time. The longer he stayed in control, the more information built around him. Patterns began to form, even though he was trying to avoid them. No one operates without patterns. Movement requires coordination. Coordination leaves traces. Even when communication is limited, even when locations change, there are still connections, people, timing, routines. And once those connections start lining up, they can be followed. At first, the pressure remained external. Rival groups increased activity along key routes again, but this time it wasn't just testing. It was persistence. They weren't looking for a quick reaction anymore. They were watching how the system adapted over time. Small disruptions turned into repeated ones. The responses were still effective, but they were no longer unpredictable. That mattered. Once a response becomes predictable, it can be studied. And once it can be studied, it can be countered. Inside the organization, he adjusted again. More layers were added. Fewer people had direct access. Operations were split into smaller segments to prevent any single point from exposing too much. These changes strengthened security, but they also created friction. Information slowed. Decisions took longer to execute. The structure was still functioning, but not with the same speed it once had. That difference wasn't obvious from the outside, but internally it was felt. And when speed drops, pressure rises. At the same time, the bounty continued to shape behavior around him. $15 million kept drawing attention. Not just from large groups, but from individuals. People who had no previous involvement began looking for ways to get close, to gather information, or to sell it. That created a different kind of threat. It wasn't direct confrontation. It was proximity. The risk was no longer just from enemies, it was from anyone who could observe, report, or pass along details. Every interaction became a potential exposure point. Every connection had to be reconsidered. Trust narrowed further. Even long-standing relationships were no longer automatic. Access became conditional. Information was controlled more tightly. The circle around him became smaller, but also more isolated. Isolation creates its own problems. The fewer people involved, the more pressure falls on each connection. If one link fails, the impact is greater. If one piece of information leaks, it carries more weight. He understood that, but there were limits to how much he could reduce risk without affecting control. Meanwhile, attention from authorities intensified. Surveillance increased. Patterns were analyzed more closely. Movements that once blended into routine began to stand out. The same adjustments that were meant to protect him, limited communication, restricted movement, also made certain behaviors more noticeable. Because when something changes, it gets studied. The environment around him was tightening from both sides. Rivals were applying pressure to expose weaknesses. Authorities were tracking patterns to locate him, and in between those forces, he had to continue operating. That required constant adjustment. Locations changed more frequently. Meetings became shorter, movement became less predictable, but also more complicated. Each shift required coordination, and coordination always carried risk. Despite that, he maintained control. Orders still moved through him. The structure remained intact. There was no visible break in authority. From the outside, it still looked stable. But stability under pressure is not the same as stability without it. Inside, the strain was building. The longer he operated under these conditions, the more difficult it became to maintain balance. Every decision had to account for multiple risks at once: operational, personal, and structural. There was no margin for error, and in that kind of environment even small mistakes matter. A delayed message, a repeated rote, an unnecessary contact. Each one adds information, each one reduces distance. That is how proximity builds without being noticed at first. The shift didn't happen all at once. It developed gradually through accumulation. More observations, more connections, more alignment between different sources of information. None of it was decisive on its own, but together it started to form a clearer picture. And once a picture starts forming, it becomes harder to break apart. He responded by tightening control again. Fewer movements, more isolation, greater reliance on a smaller group of trusted individuals. These changes reduced exposure in the short term, but they also limited flexibility. The structure became more rigid, and rigidity creates pressure points. Rivals continued pushing, but now with more precision. They weren't just testing anymore. They were targeting areas where response had slowed. They adapted to his adjustments and began working around them. At the same time, surveillance efforts became more focused. Instead of broad observation, attention narrowed towards specific patterns. Repeated behaviors were flagged. Connections were mapped more carefully. The search was no longer general. It was directed. He was still in control. That hadn't changed. But the space around him was shrinking. Every adjustment he made reduced one risk while increasing another. Every layer of protection created distance between him and the structure he was leading. That distance made control harder to maintain in real time. Still, he held the position. That was the difference between someone who collapses under pressure and someone who doesn't. But holding position and maintaining advantage are not the same thing. By this point, the situation had shifted again. He was no longer just avoiding threats. He was operating inside them. The pressure from rivals, the attention from authorities, and the internal strain from constant adjustment had all converged into one condition: sustained exposure. And once exposure reaches that level, It stops being a question of strength. It becomes a question of timing. How long before the pattern is complete? How long before the distance closes? How long before someone moves close enough to act? He was still in control, but control was no longer the only factor. Everything around him was moving toward a single point, and that point was getting closer. The break didn't come from one mistake. It came from accumulation. Weeks of movement, adjustments, and pressure had built a pattern around him. Not a complete one, not enough to act on immediately, but enough to narrow the distance. Enough for different groups to start aligning their information. That's how proximity forms, not through a single event, but through repeated observations that begin to match. By this point, he had already reduced movement to a minimum. Locations were temporary. Meetings were controlled. Communication stayed within a tight circle. Every decision was made with exposure in mind. But the system he was running still required coordination. And coordination always leaves traces. Even when routes change, the purpose behind them doesn't. Even when people rotate, the roles remain the same. Over time, those consistencies begin to stand out. They don't reveal everything, but they reduce uncertainty. And reduced uncertainty is enough. Pressure from rivals had shifted again. They were no longer testing or disrupting. They were waiting. Watching for confirmation. Waiting for the moment when enough information lined up to act without risk of failure. In that environment, acting too early creates consequences. Acting too late loses opportunity. Timing becomes the decision. At the same time, attention from authorities had narrowed further. The search was no longer broad or reactive. It had become specific. Patterns were being tracked across longer periods, not just isolated events. That changed the pace. Instead of constant movement, the pressure became focused and patient. Fewer actions, but more precise ones. The kind that don't interrupt operations immediately, but position themselves around them. Inside the organization, the strain was visible. Not in open conflict, but in hesitation. Decisions required more verification. Messages were checked more carefully. Movement slowed slightly, even when it didn't need to. That kind of hesitation doesn't break a structure, but it changes how it operates. And those changes can be noticed. He responded the same way he had from the beginning. By tightening control, fewer contacts, less movement, more separation between himself and the rest of the operation. The goal was to reduce exposure to the lowest possible level, but that approach has a limit. The less you move, the easier it becomes to define where you are not. And over time, that narrows where you could be. That's when the environment shifts again. The space around him had become smaller, even if it didn't look like it from the outside. Each adjustment had removed options. Each layer of protection had reduced flexibility. He was still operating, still in control, but now within a confined range. At this stage, information from different sources began to overlap. Observations matched, movements aligned, connections made sense. None of it was public, none of it was complete. But it was enough to move from tracking to positioning, and positioning changes everything. Because once someone is positioned correctly, action doesn't need to be rushed. It just needs to be timed. For him, that moment wasn't visible yet. Operations continued. Orders still moved through him. The structure held even under pressure. From the inside, it still functioned. But the conditions around it had already changed. He was no longer ahead of the pressure. He was inside it. Every movement now carried more weight than before. Not because it was riskier in isolation, but because it added to a pattern that was already forming. Each decision contributed to something larger than the immediate outcome. That is the point where control starts to shift again, not inside the organization, but around it. Rivals were ready, authorities were closer, and the distance between information and action had become shorter. He had taken the position and held it under pressure. But by now, the situation was no longer about maintaining control. It was about whether control was enough. Because once everything begins to align, information, timing, and position, the outcome doesn't depend on strength anymore. It depends on who moves first. And by the time that question becomes clear, the answer is usually already in motion.